Welcome everybody to the Tech Track A. This is the more developer-focused Tech Track, and this will show, well, basically everything you need to know as a developer in the upcoming year. I'm Michael Metternich. I'm one of the directors of engineering within Bloomreach. One of the most important things I want to say is that there are 10 minutes between the talks, just to be able to switch to the other room, the other tech track, and that it really is a 10-minute walk. So if you want to switch, please get up directly after the talk and go there. Otherwise, the whole schedule will be a bit of a mess. So thanks for that in advance. Then I think we can just about start. Yeah? Okay. Now I'll wait a bit more until those people are in. All from Bloomreach. I'm not going to call any names, but welcome. Okay, then without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Gijs and Michael, talking about the Bloomreach SDK for JavaScript, or the SPA within Bloomreach. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, that's working. I can hear myself. Nice. Can you all hear me? Perfect. Great. Well, welcome. We are very happy that we can kick off this Tech Track A with our first session about the new Bloomreach SDK for JavaScript. So let me begin with introducing ourselves. It always looks a bit weird when the screen is 50 times your laptop, but anyway. So we will be co-presenting for this track. On my right, on your left, is Michael Dokkelin. He is one of our senior engineers in our engineering department in Amsterdam, and he is the resident expert on all things integrating with SPAs and JavaScript-based front-end frameworks. My name is Gijs Hendricks. I am product manager, so it's my job to humbly try to balance all the different demands and requests and ideas that people have for our product, and then come up with a solution that hopefully makes everybody somewhat happy. Before we dive into the context, let me just get a little bit of an idea of who's here. I know Michael started out by saying that this track is for developers, but I'm kind of wondering whether we have only developers in the room or other people. Can you raise your hand if you are actually an engineer or an architect, so you're in the trenches in IT? Yeah. I see all the Bloomreach guys at the back raise their hands as well. That's quite a number. And who of you is in IT management? Quite a few also. And so do we also have a number of people who are more on business and business-focused roles? Yeah, quite a number. Okay, that's cool. So we have a bit of a mixed audience, which is great actually, because this talk has a section that is very much technical, but I want to start with something that's a bit more on the sort of the high level, the business side of things. So, of course, good things come in threes, so we've divided our talk into 3 sections. Start with that, the kind of the headless story. We used to call this, focus very much on SPAs, but right now I think the term headless is in more use and also describes the situation a bit better. But I want to talk a little bit about the background of headless in combination with the Bloomreach product, what we see in the market, in our customer base, and with our prospects. And then we're going to go do the actual technical deep dive, which is Michael's part of the story. And finally, I want to take you through a really quick look at what our roadmap looks like, specifically for the topic of support for integrations with front-end frameworks. Right, so let's start with the big trend You may get the impression that this is something new, but of course it isn't. It's actually been around for a while, and you've heard it mentioned in the opening keynotes this morning. The concept of microservices and the adoption of headless as a way to present your experience is actually, I think, past the hype cycle already. So we've come through all of the ideas that APIs are cool, but people don't really know what to do with them, and we're in the situation where this is actually being applied across the board. So not only do we see many of our prospects ask us about, and are really seriously considering using a decoupled presentation layer, many of our existing customers either started this way or are considering transforming their setup to use these kind of technologies as well. And just for reference, I have a few logos here for the 3 most popular JavaScript front-end frameworks at the moment. So that's React is what we see as in our customer base and prospect base at the moment is the most popular. But Angular has some good traction, and Vue is the sort of the up-and-coming hipster. I'm not even sure it's hipster anymore. It might already be established. Things move so fast in the JavaScript world that we never know next year what the next framework might be. I put a note here as well because I guess the concept of a single-page application originally is really something that is sort of client-side rendered, something that is like the ones we're all familiar with, like Google Maps and those kind of applications, really oriented to run in your browser. But more and more, I mean, as this technology is growing, people are looking at different solutions, and then we do see a lot of customers looking at least partially or completely server-side rendered solutions using Node.js. I've also put, I mean, it's a bit of a buzzword still, I guess, but PWAs, Progressive Web Apps, here, which is kind of a combination of not just these technologies, but also other technologies to create experiences that are sort of even more decoupled, I guess, being able to stay online even if backends are not available. And I guess it's a natural extension of the same thing. So this is, the key point here is that this is not going away. We see this across our customer base, and yeah, we've already invested quite some time into properly supporting it, and yeah, that's going to continue over the next years. I want to show you a big quote that sort of underlines this idea. Diane Green is actually, she just resigned, but she was the CEO of all of Google's cloud businesses, basically underscoring that same thing. So APIs and use of APIs in all kinds of context is no longer a cool thing that tech people play around with. It is something that is actually happening across the board in all kinds of scenarios. So let me talk a little bit about the benefits of using a headless setup. Because there are, of course, many reasons why people choose this kind of scenario. The first is, well, it's the user experience, in the sense that it's easier to create a breakthrough, a really great user experience using these kinds of modern technologies. It's not that it's impossible using the more traditional technologies and setups, but the velocity is just higher with these kinds of setups. The second thing is that more and more, as part of the whole microservices architecture, IT organizations are looking at decoupling different parts of the landscape. So the idea that you have a platform that does everything, but also has its own, has many stakeholders, and therefore potentially quite a long development cycle, might make it very difficult to have a lot of deployments and keep your velocity up. So by using a headless setup, you can use a separate development and deployment cycle for your front end and decouple that from your CMS, which again is like, it's about velocity. And the third thing is more sort of a practical concern, and that is that it's becoming, a lot of companies now have developers that have skill sets in one or more of these front-end frameworks, and less so in the more proprietary or somewhat more exotic frameworks that are chosen by the CMS vendors. So the point here is that if you have 50 React developers in your organization, you want to make sure that those React developers can do their work in React when they're building your front end, instead of having to learn another language, another framework that doesn't interest them and maybe doesn't give them the development speed that they want. The problem is that pure headless scenarios, where you completely decouple your CMS from your presentation layer, comes with a number of challenges. And so the idea is that when the really short history lesson, I guess, is when CMSs first started, a lot of them were headless, and the whole development cycle is very IT focused. Then CMSs developed ahead, giving business users much more flexibility and functionality to influence the way the experience looks. And if we move back to a completely headless scenario, the risk is that you lose those functionalities again. So the idea that you want to have like a WYSIWYG UI to change your content and a good preview of what the changes you're making, what they're going to look like on your site. Business users want to have control over layout, over formatting, what should go where, and not have everything go through an IT organization. And of course, CMSs have functionality nowadays, and it's not just CMSs, but it's also additional pieces of software that integrate with your CMS or your DXP for personalizing, for A/B testing. So that's all of the tools that are also available to business users now. And if you lose all of that, that is, well, it's a problem, to say the least. And that's why we've invested quite significant effort over the last year and a half to come up with what we call the Headless Experience API. And the idea is that the Bloomreach system, of course, has its innate abilities, content management. We're very strong. You can integrate with it. We have projects and workflow, and the more user-focused features like WYSIWYG editing, personalization, layout control, the ones I was just mentioning. And the idea is that you don't want to lose those when you have a decoupled presentation layer. And so the idea behind the Headless Experience API is that we don't just offer, like the Bloomreach doesn't just offer content, it offers content and structure. And we call that the page model. So the idea is that we have the page model API that provides the structure of a page and all the different elements, the content, anything external that's coming in, personalization over the top, all of that provides that in a nice JSON format to the front end. So you keep all of the functionalities you have, you just don't do the rendering, the creating the experience. And in return, to make sure that all of the preview capabilities keep working, the contract is that the presentation layer, your Angular app, your React app, or whatever you have rendering your front end, has to serve a preview back to the CMS. And that way, everything keeps working. Your business users can still do what they were expecting to do, but you have your setup where you have complete control and can develop and deploy your presentation separately. Now, you can just set this up already, but of course, this is just sort of the raw elements. If you need to dig into how all of this works and you set it all up yourself, that might take a little bit of time. And to make that easier, we have introduced a SDK. Now, we already had existing SDKs for Angular and React, but they had issues. And I think, well, quite frankly, we've heard some of our customers say that to us, that they had some struggles with it, and they were, in some cases, hesitant to use these SDKs. And the reason being sort of twofold. The first is that they were very much community-driven, so there's not they didn't originate from our engineering department. And I mean, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we want to encourage community contributions to these parts of our offering. We are, we open source after all. But at the same time, we want to have these pieces be officially supported, and officially stamp them as saying this is Bloomreach maintained, supported, designed, and it meets our criteria for good software. The second thing is that the original SDKs were very framework specific and they were originally built to serve an immediate need. And anybody who's ever worked on a piece of software can understand that you might take some shortcuts or choices in the beginning that you come to regret later when you have a more holistic view of how you want your SDK to be. And that's why we decided to go back to the drawing board and do it proper. So that takes us into the more technical description of what we have. So let's go into the tunnel, dig in deep, and I'm going to hand it over to Michael to really talk about the bowels of the new SDK.
Thanks, guys. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael. I am a senior software engineer here at Bloomreach. And today I would like to talk with you about some technical details of the SPA project. So before I move on, can I ask to raise your hands who have already tried to build something in JavaScript integrated with our Bloomreach experience? Oh, that's a lot, actually. And I hope it's going to be even more after today's presentation. So for those who didn't have a chance to use our awesome SDKs, the SPA SDK is an NPM package that simplifies headless integration with Bloomreach Experience Manager. So basically, you are building your own delivery tier outside the CMS. And this approach has some advantages, because you are free to choose stack whatever you want. You have more control over your infrastructure. And you can even go with microservices way. So, and since we are talking about single-page applications here, it also correlates with isomorphic JavaScript applications. These are applications that are running on both server-side and client-side. So we are doing initial render on server-side, then we move our next interaction with user to user's browser. And user can navigate between pages without full page reload. It's better from the performance point and provides better user experience. And next to it, we also have better search engine optimization. And as advantage from development point, we also have isomorphic code base. We have same code running on both server side and client side. It's good from maintainability point and from scalability. So before we move on to the next slide, I ask you who have already tried to build some isomorphic application using our awesome SDK. Not many. So I hope after this presentation you will be able to do that in a more easier way, and it's going to be more developers. So for those who did that and for those who didn't, just to know, it's always starting with this typical setup. This typical setup was based on using reverse proxy, running somewhere up front BRXM instance and single-page application. Usually it was third-party software. This setup was always brittle, because every time when you release new version of BRXM or your single-page application, you also have to maintain your rule set for your reverse proxy. And the second disadvantage was that there was no strict border between SPA and SDK. So the SPA was using some data generated by SDK to talk to BRXM, then it should pass back all the responses, all the data back to SDK to process that. This all was producing lots of imperative configuration glue code, which was causing and then tons of bugs in production. So architecture-wise, that wasn't so nice as well, because as Hai said, it was tied to a framework. Sometimes we had lots of duplicated code, and sometimes bug already fixed in one SDK can still take a place in another one. Sometimes we couldn't reuse some shared code in another project based on another framework or in a project based on Vanilla.js, written in Vanilla.js. And sometimes it was hard and even impossible to implement some new feature in this SDK because we had so framework-specific code which we couldn't even find where to place this feature. So we have learned from our mistakes, and as a first step, we decided to get rid of third-party software, third-party reverse proxy, and now BRXM user goes directly to BRXM instance. There, URL writer takes care of showing single-page application inside preview. And we also worked on some sort of unified rule set for URL writer. Now it should be relatively simple to get everything up and running with minimal effort, just out of the box. And as a next step, we have encapsulated all the logic responsible for interacting, integrating with BRXM inside SDK. So it should reduce amount of configuration code, and it should have a positive impact on your application code. So to achieve this, we have changed our architecture. First of all, we moved all the shared logic to a separate library. From now, the core integration layer called SPA SDK. It made it possible to have thin framework layer, which is nice from development point because we can deliver new features faster, and it's also good from maintenance point because we can fix bugs also faster, and we don't need to fix that in multiple places. So, and for those of you who are not using some common framework like React or Angular, and for some of you who are building their own framework or have their own implementation or working on project written, for instance, in Vanilla.js, this library is going to be especially helpful. So what's in there? As you can see, we have included page model fetching part and page model parsing part into this SPA SDK library. Now the SPA SDK generates a request to BRXM. Then it parses out the output, it builds tree structure out of it, and it wraps it inside JavaScript objects with fancy methods which you can easily use in your application. And there's also an integration layer which is responsible for all the user interaction in preview. It will update automatically your page model in your application when the user make a change in our UI. So as you can see on the right side of this pie chart, we haven't included presentation and transport layers into there. Well, we did that on purpose. The first reason was to provide more control over HTTP layer. You may have custom authentication mechanism, or you may need to pass some custom HTTP header to your backend. Or sometimes some frameworks, they provide built-in HTTP client, like Angular does that. In this case, you will be able to track load-in progress of your backend call. You will be able to pass some custom authorization header. You will be able to hide your CMS instance behind CMS and open it only when you have some specific header. We just provide more control over your security. So what about rendering? We didn't include that into this library, and even more, we shouldn't. As you all know, every single framework has its own rendering engine full of some optimizations, micro-optimizations, tweaks, and so on. And providing some unified solution here may cause side effects in production, some bugs, and so on. And it's better to delegate this job to the actual framework. That's what they're made for in the first place. And now, this SPA SDK library. It follows all the best practices of modern JavaScript development. It produces only immutable objects, so there will not be side effects on the next level. It's strictly typed. You can use full power of TypeScript. And npm package provides support of ECMAScript modules, so you can use this library right from the browser. It fits perfectly for all modern declarative frameworks, and event-driven model makes smooth integration with BRXM UI. And the last one, but not least, it's fully testable. It works perfectly with all modern unit testing frameworks. You can easily mock our SDK and test your components UI without actually running BRXM instance. So, and now it's time to talk a bit more about framework SDK. Can I ask React developers to raise your hands? Yeah, that's a lot. React is very popular these days. And now what about Angular? Not that many, but yeah, I think it's underestimated. And what about Vue.js? Yes, same as React, I would say. It's getting popular. So we have good news for, especially for our React developers. We have reworked our React SDK entirely. And even more, we introduced some new features. Now we support custom templates for containers. And we provide more control over ordering container items inside containers. So you can just use React Children to access container items from your container component template. Next to it, we have full support of Context API and Hooks API now. You can write a functional component which will use our context to access page model, and it will just work perfectly out of the box. Then we added support of fragments for container items templates. Now you may have container items which produce multiple DOM nodes in the end. Then we worked on native support of client-side navigation. Now it should work without any tweaks with React Router, Next Routes, and with any other routing library framework. Then we worked on improving support of universal framework Next.js. Now we support state transferring. We are transferring page model from the backend to the client, and there is no need to make an extra HTTP request to our backend, which is good from performance point. And finally, it works with test frameworks like Enzyme or Jest. You can use Context API to inject mocked page model into your component, and you can also test your React components UI without having actually running BRXM instance, so which is very nice. And now let's take a look how it will look in your code, your application code. It looks nice already. So it has clear API, just two components, BR page and BR component, and it's sort of compatible with the previous version. Now you see full power of Context API usage. You don't need to define a component to access page model. You can just use context consumer to generate this router link. Then we added support of inline components, inline templates. If you know that this component is always going to be rendered in this place, there is no need to create a component. You can just do it like we did it for footer. And this all provides us possibility to have declarative layout. It's easy to read, it's easy to understand, and it's even more easy to extend. So it looks natural. And now let's talk a bit more about framework agnostic approach. To understand it better, let's take a look at the slide. Every single page, BRXM page, starts with one root component. This root component may have multiple subcomponents, children components. And every child component may have some containers inside. And every container, again, may hold some container items. And that's it. Last two, they're actually present in the DOM. So they will be visible to the user if you want. And if we take a deeper look at this two, you'll see that it's just plain HTML markup wrapped inside some metadata, which is also HTML markup. It's pretty simple. And we can try to build something out of it using Vue.js framework. So I could build the fully integrated project in somewhat 2 working days, because it's very simple to use our SPA SDK, and it takes care of all the things behind the scenes. So now, yeah, you can check the full project out by just following this GitHub link. So if you're interested in the complete project. So now, if you look at the code on the slide, we have page component here. As I said on the previous slide, every single page starts with a root. Here we are trying to render root component inside the template. Then we import our awesome SPA SDK, for now just initialize and destroy functions. And finally, we are defining page lifecycle. So here, we are initializing the page when we are creating a component. Then we are making a call to BRXM to show us some UI, some fancy buttons, and so on, only when page is ready. And finally, we are not forgetting to clean after ourselves, so by destroying this page. So if we look a bit closer to component for page node, we'll see something like that. It's a very simple template. It's starting with rendering metadata. We have our meta component here. Then we are rendering actual nodes. If we meet container item, then we delegate rendering to the responsible component, Vue.js component. And we do pretty much the same for container. But for containers, we also pass their children in parameters. And in any other case, we are just recursively rendering all the children components. And that's it. It's pretty clear. We have only 3 branches here. It's easy to understand, and it follows the idea from the previous slide. Now, let's take a look what we've got for container. For container, we have a very simple switch here. We are just rendering specific template based on a container type, which we define on our backend. And container item looks even simpler, because here we are just rendering user-defined component, also based on a container item type, which we also define on our backend. And that's pretty much it. And if we take a look at our shiny main application template, we'll see something like that. So it follows all the recommendations of best practices for Vue.js developers. It's declarative. It looks like what we've got for React. So it's also easy to read and easy to understand, and we can put more stuff in there without any extra work. And on the right side, you can see actually running application. This application is running inside BRXM preview. You can drag and drop all the containers. You can update menu. You can put more components inside footer. You can do pretty much everything what you used to do with BRXM. And it's fully integrated application. And as I said, it was done in 2 days by using this SPA SDK. And you can check this project out by following this GitHub link. It can be a good starting point for our dear Vue.js developers. So that's it from me, and now Gijs will tell us more about our future plans.
Thanks. Yeah, so we're coming out of the tunnel again. I think a very interesting deep dive, at least I hope so. I hope this is useful for those of you who really are in the technical trenches when it comes to developing with SPAs. So before I go into the last section, which is actually fairly short, I do want to mention, so you have some time to think about it already, that we have some time for questions at the end, and we have a very fancy technical solution for it, but I'll mention that later. The last part is actually simple. It's only a single slide, and it's the headless experience roadmap. And before I show you the actual roadmap, this is often a slide when I do presentations, that gets photographed a lot. But you know, if you've ever seen a PM, a product manager on stage presenting something that has timelines, and I can tell you this slide has timelines, they're lying. Yeah, kidding, of course, but the idea is that this is our intentions, and I have to put a small disclaimer over the top. But I can tell you, and you will see from the topics we have on this list, that we have a lot of plans with our support for integrating with SPAs. And so this topic is only going to grow in importance for us and be a bigger part of our general roadmap. So without further ado, there's a number of improvements. This is not specifically related to the SDK. Some of these items are. But there's another set of additional improvements that we want to make to our product to facilitate the integration between BRXM, BRX, the platform, and your presentation layer. The first is Michael talked about you having the URL rewriter as a redirection point in the architecture, redirecting requests between the SPA, the CMS. We actually want to get rid of that. So the idea is that the reason we use this is that currently our user interface expects still the preview, the live preview that users are seeing to run on the same host, and we need to make some architectural changes to make sure that we can just take any site, any preview running anywhere, and then we remove that piece of the architecture that's currently there, simplify the whole setup, and make sure that it's even easier to get started with this kind of solutions. Next item, I have it on for Q1, Q2, but that was before I knew that Michael created the first version of a Vue.js SDK in 2 days. So maybe we should swap those around. So indeed, we have the generic JavaScript SDK available with version 14 coming out in December. We have that React-specific SDK coming out at the same time. And well, we already know Angular and Vue are both popular frameworks in our client base and prospect base. So those are going to be added. And I don't know when exactly, but it should be somewhere in the first half of next year. The rest of the items are a bit more sort of on the back end to do a couple of things. So the no-code BRXM components, basically right now, if you write a component in your SPA, there has to be an equivalent component on the XM side that basically does the information transfer, pick the content or whatever is being rendered or is needed for the rendering, and serve it out. That's Java code at the moment, and we have a lot of ideas actually also generated from our community. And Authentic is, I want to call out Authentic as one of our partners. They've really sort of are leading the field with this. The idea is that we want to create components that you can create from configuration. So for 90% of use cases for components, the information transfer is fairly simple, so we should be able to just create those on the fly in a running instance. Less redeploys, less Java code, just simpler. And then the remaining 2 items are sort of bigger, a little bit fuzzy. That's why they're down at the bottom. They might actually also move up higher if we can. But the idea is, well, GraphQL is just a technology that makes it much simpler to work with APIs and reduce a lot of the overhead of sending stuff back and forth that may not be needed. So it's a general technology that's also seeing a lot of adoption at the moment. So we are definitely considering adding a full GraphQL layer, not just for the page model API, but for all APIs in the system. And the last item is just generically that we want to extend our API offering to do a number of sort of jobs that you currently need to do still in your interaction with an SPA, for which we don't yet have an official out-of-the-box product API, and we want to add that as well. Something like, for instance, to read or update the sitemap is typically one of those items that is often requested. That's definitely in this bucket. So that's a rough idea, as I said, disclaimer, disclaimer, but you can see from the items that we have many ideas and you know, a lot of effort will be put into further making these kind of integrations with external delivery tiers and Bloomreach, basically the de facto standard of how you develop with our system. That takes us into the question section, and we have, it's a talk box, I think is what it's called. I was instructed to throw it around, but maybe you want to carry it. Well, that might be better to carry it around. It's a microphone, so the idea is if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and then Michael will bring you the box, and you can hold it here, and then everybody can hear your question. So yeah, I see one hand.
One thing, please make sure to really talk in this. So.
In the back.
Yeah, does it work? Okay. So my question is, it's mostly regarding the routing, say in the server-side rendering applications using, for example, Next.js. How do you deal with the routing issues? For example, one of the famous Next.js issue regarding the dynamic routes and the hash navigation.
That's a very good question. So in our SPA SDK, we have one argument that accepts your current URL. And you can really pass anything in there. If you use hash for routing, you can just take the hash part, the part that follows after hash, and pass it to this initialize function, or pass it inside config prop to be our page, and it will just work. And it's well tested. We are using similar approach in our internal testing. That works for sure.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Do you have any other questions? Any hands? Technical, business, or whatever you want to ask.
So one of the issues we had in the current React SDK version is actually when to render the edit button for the preview modus. So we're passing around the preview prop all the way, and then it was also quite hard to position the button correctly. It was very small, but it took us a lot of time. Did you think about a solution for that?
Yeah. Now, first of all, we can access page and page model. Inside page model, we can have a flag which says is it a preview or not, and from content button, content manage button, we can access page by using context API, and there is no need to pass through all the instances, all the tree, this preview flag anymore. That just works, and you don't need to care about this thing in your application code. So it's moved to manage content button. Very good question.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
A very simple question. Will it be also delivered open source or under license?
It's going to be open, so I'm not sure if we've decided finally where we're going to host it, but the idea is that we still, it is definitely part of our standard offering, but we also open up the source. I think, but you can probably keep me honest, that we, like we do for most of our artifacts, that we expose the code of every release and not all of the intermediate stuff, because that's in our internal repos. But whenever we bring another release, all of that code for those releases is public, right?
Yeah. That's correct.
Last question? No? Okay, then thanks everybody. Thanks Gijs and Michael.